just go back and forth. We've got questions planned.
Yeah.
We're not going to go for questions. We sat and we were like, okay, what can we talk about?
Mostly Charlotte planned it out. This is Charlotte Werner, who I emailed you guys all of her accolades and her background. So if you're looking for someone local and help with nutrition, this is a great starting point. Obviously with New York City half, it kind of feels like the perfect time to start talking about nutrition, and then leading into the summer months, thinking about electrolytes, thinking about carbs ahead of time, and then as we get ready for full marathons, just already having a plan in place to kind of make sure that you're doing what works for you and not just scouring the internet and seeing what some TikToker says and trying random things. So I'll leave it to Charlotte. I'll obviously be here too, and whatever questions come up, we'll answer those however they fit the protocol. Cool, Charlotte, take it away.
So, hi guys, so I'm Charlotte. As I mentioned, I am a registered dietitian. I have my master's degree in clinical nutrition from NYU. I've worked in a lot of different settings as a dietitian, and I feel like my road, I've talked to Sam about this a million times, my road has been like, not the typical route of a dietitian. So I've worked the traditional outpatient in a hospital setting, but I've also worked for some food companies. I was at a food company called Huel for about 3 years. I also worked for The Feed, which you guys may or may not be familiar with, and I was the head of their coaching program. So my job was to help get that program off the ground. It provided free one-to-one coaching to all athletes in relation to supplements. They've taken it in a sort of different direction, and there's one person still left there for it, but it's mostly within customer service. But if you do have any questions, they're a wonderful resource for all things supplements. We've tried pretty much everything on the team, so everyone at The Feed really knows what they're talking about when it comes to flavors, textures, that kind of stuff. But I'm also here if you guys have any questions on that, because I have tried pretty much everything. And I'm also an ultra runner, so I love running distances ranging from half marathons all the way through 100-mile ultras. I really like when you combine nutrition, proper training, and recovery, and how you can really maximize your performance and also how you feel, right? Because that's most important. If you cross the finish line and you feel terrible, and then you feel terrible for the next 2 months after that stinks. So nutrition plays a huge role in just making sure you feel your best both throughout training and then also afterwards. And it's honestly the thing that people tend to forget about, unfortunately. Like they're like, oh, nutrition's like, I can just figure it out as I'm running. But it really will deter and hurt your performance if you're not adequately fueling and hydrating while you're actually racing. And you can see it even in professional athletes, right? If you watch them in any sort of really hot or really humid conditions, if we think about New York 2 years ago now, when it was so humid, a lot of the pros were even struggling, and it's not something you typically see. And so I think it's really important just to emphasize that for no matter who you are, nutrition is really, really important. And so I've just started my current venture in December called Charlotte Werner Nutrition, which is my own private practice. It's a sports nutrition private practice and consulting company. So I work with athletes one-to-one. We develop both a training plan when it comes to nutrition, so looking at how your training is going, what you're doing on the day-to-day, and then really maximizing the nutrition component of it to make sure you have a full-rounded training plan and that you're also feeling your best. And then I also consult with run clubs and then also with some gyms and larger corporations to help them from a nutrition side of things. So that's a little bit of my background. I've been running for over a decade. I just love running, especially in New York. I've been a born and raised New Yorker. So for me, running has been like always part of my life. You see people running in Central Park, everywhere you go. My dog, I wish she was a runner, but she sits in her little stroller and I push her along. One day, I was like, maybe she'll enjoy it if she just sees that it's fun, but it's too comfy for her. But that's just a little bit about me. So I want to just kind of first get a lay of the land. What are we training for? Does anybody have any questions off the bat kind of following that? But does anybody, so we've got some London, some United half, any other marathons, halves, 5Ks even?
I think all distances are covered by anyone that's watching the video in the next probably 4 months, and then leading into like fall marathon. So we started the In Training program on Jan 1 through the end of March as kind of it's a lot of new to us runners, but also to incorporate strength, to incorporate more of the nutrition side of things, just adding new elements of it. So some people have no interest in racing. Some people are kind of getting their feet wet. Like the amount of messages I have, like, oh, maybe I do want to do a half is kind of cool, where that was never really the initial outset. And so now to have a little bit more knowledge about that, now that people are getting into 75, 90-minute longer runs, It's kind of perfect timing, and I think the first upcoming race is United Half in 2 weeks, and then from there I feel like spring is really busy till May, and then it picks up again starting in July.
The lovely New York summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just one point off of that, Sam, that you mentioned is even if you're not training for a race specifically, so even if you're just running for fun and you're running longer distances, you still need to fuel and you still need to hydrate. I think people forget that sometimes. Like even if you're just going out for fun and you're going out for 75 to 90 minutes, you have no goals of racing in the near future, you still need to fuel while you're actually out there. And for some people, it's hard to kind of grasp just how much your body needs in these kinds of scenarios because you're like, oh, I feel fine. But when you finish a run, if it's 75 to 90 minutes, your body's going to be completely depleted if you haven't fueled and you haven't hydrated properly while you're out there. Even if you're going for a fun run with your friends where you're at a conversational piece. And so what I typically recommend if you've never fueled before, ever, if you kind of just go out and you just try your best every once in a while to take a gel, is just really focus first and foremost on small goals that are attainable for you. So when you're going for over 75 minutes, even if it's just once a week to start, I know that sounds crazy, but even if it's just once a week to start, if you're going that kind of distance, just try to get in some sort of a gel, some sort of chews if you enjoy chews, a bar if you like the bars. Every 30 minutes or so, just try to have something that has 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrates in it. Now, for some people, that would be a bit challenging, right? Because it's not something they're used to. So we want to work our way towards that, and if you don't hit every single marker, it's okay. And I think something that happens a lot, especially with runners that I work with and endurance athletes more generally, is that we tend to get down on ourselves like, oh, I couldn't make it, I couldn't do it. But no matter what, even if you hit it every 45 minutes to start, that's still progress, right? That's still you showing that you're trying and you're working towards a goal. And even if you don't like a gel that you try, or even if a specific kind of strategy that we try doesn't work for you, that's something we didn't know before, right? And so I always tell runners, especially because runners always tend to, myself included, be like, oh, like, why did that one work? Is it me? And it's not you. Everyone is so different. And so I don't really love giving specific numbers for everyone because, like, as a general rule of thumb, saying, like, you need 90, because you might not. You might be okay with 75 grams of carbs an hour at a really high intensity. And so it kind of, when you look at training in comparison to racing, it depends on intensity level what you actually need. And so if you're going at a really low intensity, you don't need as much as if, say, you're racing your half marathon or your London marathon, right? But you still need some carbohydrates as you're going. So what I typically recommend is, say you're aiming for 60 grams of carbs an hour, right? Every single hour that you're out there when you're going for an hour or more in duration. If you're just going at an easy pace, try to get at least half of that, right? Because that's going to be your easier, more conversational pace. So that's where we want to start. So if you can get 30 grams an hour, a gel every hour at a kind of lower, slower pace, I'm okay with that. And we want to work from there, right? That's the starting point. And so whenever I work with athletes, we start slow, we start low, and then we gradually build up. It's the same thing for hydration. But before I kind of move forward into fueling, does anyone have any questions on kind of just the general intensity levels, durations that I talked about?
So you said 30 grams or 60 grams an hour, depending on
and
full throttle or just
exactly
easy pace. Where did you get that? Like, is that based on weight? How is that?
So, good question. So when it comes to how much someone needs, it is technically based on kilograms of body weight, but we typically use the like 150 kilogram kind of average as the baseline. So it's 60 to 90 grams is the typical range for high intensity, and then 30 to 45 grams for lower intensity. Over the course of an entire day, if you want to kind of get into the specifics of how much you need as an endurance athlete, it's anywhere from 7 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight in terms of carbohydrates. So if you weigh 50 kilograms, then you want to multiply by 7 and by 12, and that's kind of the range of carbohydrates throughout the day. So not for a specific kind of session, but for the entire day, and it's going to be a lot of carbohydrates, right? So I don't want you to kind of get like overwhelmed if you're looking at that number and like, how do I even achieve that? Yeah, bread, exactly. But you want to work towards that. And it really depends too on where you are in your training cycle, how hard you're training. And so I work with athletes to kind of fine tune that, but it's 7 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates specifically. And so that's kind of the starting point. 12 grams is really like those professional, like if you're doing say 2 hours multiple times a week, that's when you want to aim for more like 12. But I typically start athletes around 7, and then we kind of figure out where you need to be from there. But that's like your daily needs. And then when you're specifically training, probably 60 grams will be okay as a starting point. And then everyone's different. So like, for example, me, I prefer more carbohydrates when I'm running. So I started around 60 to 75, probably 3 or 4 years ago. I was like, oh, I do need more, okay. And I've been racing since probably 2016, like trying to actually improve my performance since then. And when I started going closer to 100 grams, that's when I actually noticed for me that I was like really able to boost my performance. And so for a lot of people, it's gonna just depend on how you feel and what you can actually take in. Because ideally, if you can take in more carbohydrates, that's fuel, right? Your body's burning through a ton of fuel. And so for me, I know if I'm at 70, I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like I could give a little bit more, but it's not quite where I want to be. But last year in the United Half, I did 100, which I know sounds like a lot, and it is. It's a lot of carbohydrates, but it felt really good. And in the marathon, I actually did 106. So for me, that feels good. But everyone is so different. I have an athlete who she's fantastic, really fast, but she's good at 75. And so it really just depends on the person too, in terms of like in the actual race, what your body's gonna need. But on the day-to-day, that 7 to 12 range is pretty good. Good question. Any other questions on that?
I have 2 notes on that.
Sure.
One, we usually say from 75 to 90 minutes is when you really need to start fueling. What would your approach be for someone who is running easy, 35, 45, 60 minutes? Is that where you would have someone train their gut, or do you wait until you're at that 75 to 90 minute? I'm always kind of less than 75 minutes, I'm still eating before, but I never feel like I need anything during.
Yeah.
But is that kind of the standard of practice, or would you say like, no, that's when you do kind of test out the gels? Because it's not really enough time or intensity to know.
And so it's gonna, so that's a great question. So if you're going for under 60 minutes, you don't really need fuel during. You really don't. But that before kind of snack or meal, depending on how much time you have, is gonna be really important. And so the general rule of thumb, if you have an hour before, say, a race or a training session, even if it's 45 minutes, even if it's 30 minutes, if you have an hour, it's 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. That's what you want to aim for in terms of like a snack. If you have 2 hours, it's 2 grams, 3 hours, 3 grams, 4 hours, 4 grams. And so it just depends on how much time you have. And then also tolerance, right? Some people can tolerate a little bit more than that an hour before, but others can't. Fiber is the other huge factor. So when you're racing, or even just in a general training session, especially if they're more kind of important for you, if they're key training sessions, you want to try to reduce the amount of fiber that you're having, because that's going to be harder for you to digest. You also want to reduce the amount of like raw fruits and vegetables that you're having. It's called roughage. That's how we refer to it clinically, and that's just harder for your body to digest. And so a smoothie, for example, is going to be a little bit easier than say a salad, even though they've both got the same kinds of things in them. If you throw some kale into a smoothie, your body's gonna have an easier time digesting that than if you have it in a salad before, say 2 hours before you go out for a run. And so just keep that in mind, especially if you're a runner who likes to run after work or kind of in the middle of the day. That's just something to consider when you're out there training and racing. But for the most part, lower fiber, lower fat tends to be better digested for most people in the say 1 to 2 hour range before you're going out. Never try anything new either before key sessions. But if it's kind of like, you're just going out for a 45-minute run, it's your just normal day, you have nothing kind of key coming up, you can try some new stuff out. That's what I really want you to try new things, because otherwise you'll never try kind of to add in more variety. And so that's where I really try to push it a little bit, is in those not so key training sessions, kind of just the day-to-day routine where you're building that base. That's where you can try out whether it's new types of carbohydrates, different types. Maybe you want to try a little bit more fat to see if it does help you, because some people do metabolize fat a little bit better than others, and so you might be able to handle it. Some people also just have stomachs of steel and can pretty much have anything right before the race, right? But others have a lot more of a sensitive stomach. And so if you do have a more sensitive stomach, lower fiber, lower fat will be digested better for you. Things like graham crackers, wonderful. Things, even like a gel. If you want to have a gel an hour before, that's totally fine. Like that can be the thing that you have if it's really early in the morning, or a bar, right? Easy, simple, something that you can get down. Oat-based tends to work pretty well for people, like a granola bar. I love Nature Valley bars, like they're really good, they're really simple, you can buy them in the store. You can also get the fancier, more sports nutrition type bars if you want to, but you can also just go really basic. Either way is totally fine, and it just depends on preference at that point. If you're someone who does like more savory options, or something that's a little bit more salty, I like even just pretzels, like if you like them filled with like the peanut butter or a little bit of almond butter, if you do tolerate the higher fat content, that's a wonderful option too. And so that's something else that you could have, say, an hour before your race or your run, see how you tolerate it, and then go from there. Great question.
My other point on that is, I'm like on the slow drip method. I like start fueling at 25 minutes and I'm fueling like every 5 minutes. I'm not taking a full gel, and we'll talk about it, but like using the handheld that has 5 gels in it, I'm just constantly like taking fuel in, and so in that bag or in the handheld is over 200 grams of carbs. So I know that over the course of that run, that's how much I'm taking in.
Exactly.
But I don't think it has to be so measured. Like that's something just that I want you to protect yourselves from, of like, don't obsess over, you'll know how much it is. Like find out, okay, I did 5 gels, each one was 30 grams, there's 150 grams, know that going into it, instead of it has to be this exact timing, or like every 25 minutes for me is really better than waiting till 30 or 45 minutes, and eating even more frequently than that actually feels much better to me, because it's like, I'm not worried about when the next thing is coming in, it's just constantly feeding the system.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too. In a lot of nutrition, it's ranges. Anyone who tells you like this is the exact amount you need, they're lying. They have no idea, right? It's all about ranges and then individual preference and tolerance and just by person, right? What I prefer is more like 15 minutes. Every 15 or so minutes, I take in a little bit just to kind of keep my body going. And then you want to just make sure that once you start fueling, you're consistent after that. I think that's the most important factor, is just making sure if you start it, every 15, 20 minutes and you want to fuel every 25 minutes or so, make sure you just try to get in something at that point, but you don't have to worry, especially if you do like to use so my favorite thing, Sam knows this, is these soft flasks. These are like
life-changing. Really,
so,
I have like 7 of them.
Yeah, so everyone is like, how do you carry all your gels, whether it's for a half marathon or a full marathon, if you're going for even 60 grams an hour, right? Even if you're not going for the higher end of 90 or 100 grams an hour, how do you carry all that, right? If you're out there for 2 or 3 hours, or 4, 5, 6 hours for a marathon, that's a lot of fuel, right? These flasks can actually hold like 5 gels. So you just pour your gels in here, right? Like the night before the race, I tend to just pour them in here, leave it in the fridge. Or you can do it in the morning, depending on how early it is and if you trust yourself to wake up early enough. But you can then just take like little bits of it every 5-10 minutes if that's what you prefer, if that's what your body kind of enjoys and it feels good for you. You can totally do that. But some people don't love feeling like they're kind of eating all the time. Like they like to take some and then go, and then take some and then go every like 30 to 45 minutes, and that's okay too. But with this flask, okay, like typically for me, it carries about 200 grams of carbs. So it can be anywhere from, it'd be 8 Mortons. It can carry 8 Mortons in here. So it does carry quite a bit, right? You can have, I had one in each pocket at one point. I was like, whoa, the gels are just like bouncing up and down. But what is really nice is, okay, if my goal is 100 grams an hour, by an hour in, I just have to get through half of this. And like, you don't have to be like kind of like measuring it halfway through. Just try to get there, and then by the end, just try to get the full thing done, right? If that's what your goal is, and then you have a 2-hour goal. And so these can be really helpful in those scenarios, just to make sure you don't have to carry as much. If you want to put it in a belt, you can also do that. It's really up to you and your preference. And the other thing that I actually did for New York is I had some of my carbs in a bottle. So I had some liquid carbs, and these fit in my side pocket. So you could carry some fluids with you too, which was really nice. And this one's actually from Hydro Flask, but the feed has them also. They're just the marathon bottles. They're 400 milliliters. And so you can add a little bit of carbs in here with a little bit of your hydration. If you don't love the hydration, of course, that's another way to make sure you're still hydrating. If you also don't love the salt stick chews, because some people it's hit or miss with those, and they only have about 50 milligrams of sodium per, one of the little chews. So you'll need quite a few if your goal is, 300, 400 milligrams of sodium. So this could be another way to get in some more carbs and some more fluids. It's easy to carry, so you'll have lots of stuff in your pockets, but I promise you it's not as hard as it seems. Just try it out in practice, try it out in training, see what you like, see what you enjoy. Even if you don't have a race, even if you're just running for fun, it's still important to make sure you're fueling, and these can be really helpful, especially in the summer when it's hot and your fueling needs, because you're going to be working harder because it's hotter, it's a little more intense out there, you are going to need a little bit more fuel. And so this can be really helpful, especially in the summer, so you don't have to stop at home, pick up some more, like hide it in Central Park and hope nobody takes it. Which could also wouldn't recommend that.
I find that they're easy to carry too. Like I often run like shorts in a sports bra in the summer. Yeah. I don't actually mind carrying it. It gets lighter as you go. Yeah. Same thing with the water bottles, or I'll even pick up like a 500 milliliter water bottle, fill that up, and then just ditch it halfway through. Exactly. So it never has to be this like over thought out, like I need more belts or more vests or more this. Like if you can find ways that are comfortable for you, like I don't love carrying stuff in my hand, but when it comes to fuel, at least it's like quick, it's light, it's not weighing me down in any way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times with gels specifically, also even opening them, if you guys have ever had any issues with gels, especially in a race, it's so frustrating. Because then there's some points where you're just like, screw it, and I got it done. So this can help prevent that too, which is also important because you cut them all open ahead of time. It's all in your flasks. You know how much is in there. You can also mix gels together if you're a fan of I know that sounds a little weird, but for New York, I actually mixed Morton probably would say never to do this, but I mixed Morton with 60, which is another energy gel product because it had some sodium in it. And so a lot of gels are now coming out onto the market that have sodium in them too, and it's a 2-for-1 for athletes, right? Because you're getting sodium, you're also getting your fuel and your carbohydrates, and then all you have to do is worry about really water on the water stations, right? The Gatorade, you never know how that's being mixed. It's hit or miss. And you never know how much you're gonna get, one in the little cup, but also how much is actually gonna make it into your mouth. And so I find that if you can have a gel that also has some electrolytes in there, when it comes to water, it's a little bit easier, and it's also a little bit less stressful for you guys when you're out there training and racing, especially in the summer, if you can find a gel that has some electrolytes in there. So I actually did, in one of my flasks, it was like half 60 mango and then half Morton, and I just mixed it all up. And so it was like a little mango flavor, but it wasn't too overwhelming, because I find that sometimes gels can be really, really cloyingly sweet. So if you can mix some of the unflavored gels with the flavored, if you're someone who doesn't want as much sweetness, that's another huge way to have a win, because then you won't get sick of it by hour 2 or 3 that you might be out there training, or even if you're out there for an hour and a half, right? Or 60 minutes. When you're on kind of like gel number 2, 3, it starts to be like, okay, this is a little bit much. And then when gel 4, 5, and 6 comes on, you're like, no more. So this can be a really nice way to just mix it up, make sure you're not getting anything too sweet. And then also just to kind of play around with what you prefer, right? You can really make it your own. And all of my athletes, when I work with them one-to-one, we make up your own kind of concoctions, right? And so it's really nice because you know this is what works for me, this is what I'm going to be using, and it's going to differ. And I think that's really what a lot of athletes don't realize is, you can fuel the same as a professional athlete, but you might not have the same experience. In fact, I'm pretty sure everyone's going to need different things, right? And so you can even see from professional athlete to professional athlete, they also fuel differently to one another. They have different preferences. And so I think it's really important to honor those preferences. And while there might be some gels that are more popular, that doesn't mean that you have to use them too. You can have other gels that you prefer, other gels that work well for you, and I would really encourage you to try as many as possible while you're in the easier training blocks, because that's going to be where you can see what works for you and what doesn't. The other thing I would say is I recommend trying in a few different scenarios. So the first is on a really long run. So anything over, say, 90 minutes, you really want to try and see how the fuel sits with you on an easy long run when you're up towards the end, right? Because that's where things get a little shaky, your stomach's feeling a little uncomfy maybe, and if you've already been taking down a lot of fuel, your body's getting a bit tired, you might notice, one, you really don't like that gel on hour 2, and you need something else at that point, you need some more variety. And you might also notice that maybe you don't tolerate it anymore at that point. And so that's one kind of way and space that I would recommend that you try it. The other is in a harder, kind of less time consuming workout. So typically I wouldn't recommend like 45, 60-minute workouts to try gels, but especially like say a month out from a key race, in a couple of say more intense track workouts or just more intense workouts that you're doing where your heart rate's gonna be a lot higher, where your breathing's gonna be a bit more labored, that's where I also want you to try a gel, because you might notice you love chews when it's like, for example, chews. You might notice you love chews in the lower intensity long runs. You put yourself on the track, or you have 400-meter sprints, and you're like, this is not going down. This is just not, it's not going to happen. I can't chew anymore. And so that's really important for you to know. And so I would recommend, in a few instances, not always, but just in a few instances, more from a how you tolerate it standpoint, trialing those gels, chews, solids, whatever it is that you might be interested in using on shorter workouts that are higher intensity, just to see how it goes. The one last place that I always tell athletes to trial and to really focus on, because this tends to get lost when you're racing, especially in half and full distance marathons, is that in the last, say, 3 to 5 miles, we do a really good job of telling ourselves we don't need any more fuel because we're exhausted. And so I have athletes, once we've kind of figured out what you enjoy, what your needs are roughly, right? We don't need to get to the specifics, just the range of what works for you, whether it's 60 to 75 grams, 50 to 75 grams, right? There can be a range that works for you, or 90 grams an hour. Once we figure out kind of those different pieces, the next thing I have athletes do is I have them within the month out from that key race or training session, what I would have you do is also practice in the last half of your long runs, and athletes hate this, but it's so important because you want it to be muscle memory, getting in those gels. And I know when you're like, I have 3 miles left, do I really need it?
It's a cool down.
Yeah, exactly, like, I can almost see the finish line sort of, but I still have 3 miles left, so like, do I really need it? I'm done, like I just want to sprint to the finish, I can't stand like looking at another sugary thing. That's the moment I want you to practice, because I always kind of relate it to, like if you're driving, say a car somewhere, right, and your car's running out of fuel. You're like, I could probably make it, but like, should I stop to get a little bit more fuel just to make sure I don't stall out, right? That's the same kind of idea. We want to give ourselves the fuel to get us to the finish line because you want to finish strong. You don't want to finish completely out of everything. And so we've worked so hard to get you to that point where you have, say, 3 to 5 miles left. We don't want to drop the ball on fueling at that point. And so really practice that moment, because I think that's a key space that athletes can actually really excel in their performance. If we just kind of fine tune those last, say, 15, 20 minutes of their race, you'll notice a huge difference in how you finish and how strong you can finish. I've done it millions of times, like, do I really? I'm like, just do it, okay. And then you feel a lot better than if you didn't do that. And I've heard that from countless athletes to this day, where they're like, I don't know how I was talking myself out of it, but now that you try it, you realize how much better you feel, and you're not gonna stall out at the finish line, which is also important. Any other questions on like the fueling side of things before we move over to hydration?
Real quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Caffeine is like always advertised, and I got the Morton's gel, and I've not ran in a long time, so I specify that. But when I did, it was non-caffeinated always. Is there a benefit besides?
Yeah. So caffeine, it varies by person. Some people are sensitive to caffeine. So if you're sensitive to caffeine, would not recommend it. If you're someone who like you feel the effects right away, you get really jittery, it's not something, you don't need that, right? We don't want you feeling that way during the middle of the race or at the start of the race, especially when we're already feeling anxious. We don't need any more jitters. But if you find that you do enjoy caffeine, you have coffee during the day and you're okay with it, then we can talk about caffeine and adding it in. Caffeine does have performance enhancing effects, so it can give you a little bit more of a burst of energy. And so that's why people do like using it, but it's not for every jet. So the way that I typically recommend it is for a half marathon. So caffeine, the way it works is kind of it peaks and then it slowly comes down. And it kind of peaks about an hour in and then it starts to come down a little bit more, but it has a half-life of about 4 hours. And so you kind of still feel a little bit of the effects over those 4 hours, but if you're in, say, a half marathon, you'd want to feel that effect at the hour mark, right? You'd want to be like halfway through your race when it's like, okay, yes, here it is. So we want to make sure that you have that caffeinated gel, say 30 minutes before you go on the start line, right? Because you want to feel those effects in the race. You don't want it to be towards the end of the race by the time it kicks in. In a marathon, I would recommend 2 caffeinated gels. So one at the start line, so it peaks about halfway through, depending on the person, about an hour, 2 hours in, right? And then another one about halfway through so that it peaks towards the end and gives you that burst to kind of get to the finish line. But it's not the first thing I would work on with athletes. So I think I get the question all the time from athletes of like, okay, what can I add in to boost my performance? Whether it's nitric oxide, caffeine, whatever it might be. My first point of call is how are you fueling and how are you hydrating? Because if you're not fueling right and you're not hydrating right, caffeine, nitric oxide, beta alanine, yeah, it's pointless, exactly. It's not going to do very much for you, and in fact, it could actually hurt your performance, especially with caffeine. If you've got a lot of caffeine but not much else, you might just feel really jittery. That will not end well for you. So you want to be mindful of that, but I would practice it in training too and see how it feels. Especially if you're training for a marathon, I would just practice with 1 to start even, and then see how that feels, and then work a second one in during a long run and see. It's not going to be the exact same because your marathon might be 4, 5, 6 hours, but it'll give you an idea of, okay, how do I feel with 1 versus how do I feel with 2? And what you can do is have most of your gels here that are non-caffeinated and then just carry 1 extra caffeinated gel on the side so that you don't have to worry, this is my 1 caffeinated gel and then everything else is good to go. Yeah, I can just take that in over time and I don't have to worry. And so that's what I would recommend is 1 about 30 minutes before for a half, you only really need 1, and then 1 about 30 minutes before for the marathon, and then about halfway through to kind of get you to that finish line. Great question. Any other questions on caffeine, gels?
What's nitric oxide?
Great questions. It's like carbon plate and juice and everything else up there. Yeah. So nitric oxide is something that helps to basically open up your blood vessels and move your blood through your system a bit more kind of efficiently. It's found in things like beets, watermelon. So there's something called L-citrulline in watermelon, and that turns into nitric oxide in the body, which helps you to kind of circulate that blood a little bit faster. So that's why you might see people taking like beet shots or beet supplements because of its ability to function in that nitric oxide pathway. And so I get questions all the time like, will nitric oxide help me? It's like, it could, but if we're not fueling right and we're not hydrating right, it's not gonna do anything. Yeah. And so the idea is that it'll help you to move the blood through your system more efficiently so that you can work harder and deliver oxygen ultimately to your cells, which is what you want to do.
And that's another thing to practice because I really like it, but Jenna gets lightheaded when she takes it.
Exactly.
So like it's not something that we couldn't figure out what was like affecting her, and at every race feeling lightheaded. Why do you feel this way? What did you do differently? And once she took that out, she stopped having it. So her system might just be flushing her blood better through her system during these workouts than mine is. But I do get like a little bit buzzy off of it too, which I don't love. Like some people take 2 and 3 and they're like taking them during the race. The Survito or yeah, and I actually really do like that one when I do my 50K. Like you feel a difference in how like when you breathe, you feel that you're actually
and it lowers your blood. It can lower people's
your heart rate slower. So, it's a very cool effect, but it's not for everyone.
100% legal.
We're not blood. There's a video of me running past everyone going, where's my beef? Jenna couldn't find it.
I couldn't find it. Everyone was freaking out.
I would have found some water.
It was amazing.
Just give you a giant glass of water.
Yeah.
Take it, you're fine.
Take it.
Yeah, but it really does depend on the person. Then also, obviously, if you're taking medications, you just want to be mindful. Caffeine, any sort of supplement you take, just be mindful of that. And I can work with you on that. So if you do have any questions, that's another thing that I can do personally as a dietitian. I also take insurance, which is great. So depending on the insurance, you can submit it for reimbursement. But when it comes to medications, some people don't realize that a lot of medications can interact with different supplements. So just be mindful of that as you do add supplements. if you are taking anything, ask your doctor. You can also ask me, I can help you. And just make sure you're trying it out in training. No matter what you do, everything, the golden rule is try it in training first. See how you feel, and then if something is different, start with one at a time. So I never recommend athletes change more than 1 or 2 things within like a weekly period, because if something does go wrong, like when Jenna was like, what I do differently? If you're changing 6 or 7 different things, you don't know which one of those 6 or 7 things caused you to feel that way. If you change one thing at a time, even if it's just a gel, change them one at a time. Don't change too many at once, because then if you're having GI problems, you don't know which gel it was that's causing this to happen. And so I know it's hard because it's a slower process and it does take patience. But in a lot of nutrition, if someone tells you there's a quick fix or a magic something that you can take or do, it's not true. You need to do it slow, and you need to figure out what works for you. We don't create habits overnight, and we're not going to break them that way either. And our body doesn't work in the fashion that people think it does, where you can just change everything and you'll be fine. So low and slow, make your change. I know it sounds crazy, but even if it's you're changing one gel, or how often you take that one gel, those should be your 1 or 2 goals in that week. No more than that. See how you feel. Even if you're just changing the timing, that's one of your 2 goals that week, right? Don't go crazy. Don't make 5 or 6 changes in the week, because then you won't know what's causing you to feel a certain way, and it'll be a lot harder for you to kind of do some investigating to figure out what the issue was. And I'm sure with Jenna, if nothing else was changed, she was able to then say, this is what did it. And that was a lot easier for her than having to kind of piece through 1,000 different kind of ways and things that she's changed to be like, what is this? But the other thing I wanted to say is that if you don't like gels, that's okay. Because I think a lot of times people think that everyone needs gels, or you can't race with chews. You totally can. You can race with bars, you can race with chews. It's a matter of preference and tolerance. And I always get asked, what's the best sports nutrition product on the market when it comes to fueling? And my 2 biggest points is taste and tolerance. And I think that always shocks people. It's like, it doesn't have to have the extra stuff. And the extra stuff doesn't matter if you don't like the taste and you don't tolerate it well. Because whether it's a gel, a chew, or a bar, if you enjoy the taste of those chews, you can take them down at high intensities and you have no problems doing so. There's no problem taking chews. If you enjoy solids, like a Morton solid or the Never Second bars or any other type of bar, that's totally fine. You can take those down and you can use them if that's what works for you. You don't have to kind of stick to the same thing everyone else is doing. It's really, really individualized in that way. And then it also comes to tolerance, right? So the taste portion, do you like the way it tastes? Do you like the way it tastes 2 hours in, 3 hours in, 4 hours in, 5+ hours in? And then the other is tolerance, and do you tolerate it at those kinds of times? Then add in variety, and then thinking about your GI tract, how everything's working through there, and just really practicing those longer durations. It's kind of like training your mind. Everyone's always talking about training the gut, but I personally believe you also really need to train the mind, because you can really talk yourself out. It's really easy to do when you're really feeling very run down at the end of a race or a long training session, to tell yourself, okay, I'll figure this one out later. We don't need this right now. So just try your best to train the mind too in those training sessions, and really think about how you felt afterwards and kind of small ways you can tweak that to get just a little bit more fuel in, or to maybe change the fueling that you're using to really optimize your performance and how you feel.
I think that's a good place where liquid carbs come in too.
Yes.
But I always do like 2 scoops of scratch, even though it's 1 scoop of scratch, but it's like you're getting 50 grams more of carbs while you're hydrating, and you're getting sodium. So if you do, like if I'm at the end of a 20-mile run and the last 2 miles I really don't want to have that, at least I have my liquid fuel, so that I'm getting something in my system, and then going home and like forcing myself to eat right away, instead of let me try and take this down, I feel like I'm gonna throw up, this doesn't feel good anymore. It doesn't happen every time. Like you just want to have kind of something in the back of your mind of like, what else does work if that fails? Because kind of like Charlotte said, you don't know how the water is mixed on race day. Like you may think you're getting Gatorade with like sugar and sodium and all this stuff, and it might be like really watered down. So you're getting maybe a quarter of what you actually need every 15 minutes or every 25 minutes when you're passing the water station. So just something to play with. I only tolerate the lemon lime flavor. All the other flavors don't sit well with me. I'm like, so now we have literally like 4 3-pound bags, and I'm just like, every day loading up on this, but it is a really easy way to make sure that you will take it in, because you often don't have time swallowing liquid when you're on the run, but once you're like, your mouth gets tired of chewing, and that's another trick that I learned along the way is like, you can just swish it around your mouth and spit it out, and your body, your carb receptors start to feel like they're actually taking in energy, so whatever you get in does help. Like if you are in a place where you're like, I'm gonna puke if I literally take this gel, I will like swish it around in my mouth and then spit it out. Make sure no one's around you, but at least that way your carb receptors understand. I've been spit on several times. Sneezed on, snot rocketed on. People have no awareness, so we need to have awareness. But it makes a huge difference just to kind of like put some liquid in your mouth, swish it around, maybe swallow some of it, spit out what you don't want, but to at least make sure that you're not missing any of your markers along the way, and that's usually in like the last maybe fifth of a race, half or full, where I'm like, I don't really want to take this right now because I don't know if I'll throw up when I cross the finish line, so how can I at least make sure that I still have something in my body?
Yeah, exactly, that's a really good point. And it won't provide you with a lot of carbohydrates, like you're spitting it out, but it will help you to, your brain does kind of register that you're getting a little bit of sweetness in your mouth, and so it may give you a false sense of like, okay, I can make it now, rather than not having anything and really feeling super, super depleted. So it's like your emergency button. Like if you get it, like this is, you press that emergency button, you know you're not gonna swallow it, just look around, especially nice.
Or like, don't wear PSRC.
Sam told me to!
Do not wear PSRC.
But that's a really good point, and I think, you know, whatever you can get down, that's ultimately most important. Like if you can even get a little, that's a win, right? It's better than nothing. And the other kind of main factor and most important thing to remember is that it's not so specific. Like if you can get in a gel every 30 minutes or it's every 45 minutes, it doesn't really matter. It's what works for you. And that's kind of ultimately what's most important. Some people are good at 60 grams an hour, some people are good at 90, some are good at 50. Really depends on the person. And so just make sure you remember that as you do play around with the amount of carbohydrates you're taking in, both during and then before and after. And the one last thing I want to talk about with fueling in regards to carbohydrates is after. So you brought up kind of making sure you're getting in enough after you're done with your training session. No matter what training session you're doing, you really want to make sure you're getting in some form of fueling within an hour. The reason being that that's kind of like the main kind of point that you can capitalize on your muscles and your body really absorbing and digesting everything that you're taking in and really kind of having the best experience with it too. So you want to get carbohydrates in after. People don't typically talk about carbs, it's always protein, and protein is needed. You want about 20 grams of protein minimum in that hour after you're done, no matter what kind of training you're doing, whether it's 45 minutes, a 30-minute session, an hour session, a 90-minute session, 20 grams of carbs is the minimum that you want to aim for. You also want 20 grams of protein, sorry. You also want carbohydrates. So my general rule of thumb is a minimum of a 1-to-1. So a 1-to-1 of carbohydrates to protein, but you could go all the way up to a 1-to-4, so 4 times the amount of carbohydrates. The reason being that even if you're fueling during, you're not even really getting in half of what your body needs to really sustain you. You're just trying to keep yourself at a baseline. And so after you're done, if it's like a 30-minute session, a 45-minute session, you're good with say 20 grams of protein, 20 grams of carbohydrate. If you can get in like chocolate milk, amazing. It's gonna have a little bit more than probably 20 grams of protein and 20 grams of carbs, which is even better. But if you're going for say an hour or 75 minutes, then that's when you wanna start to go every 1 gram of protein, you'll want 2 to 3 grams of carbs. So 20 grams of protein with at least 40, maybe even 60, 80 grams of carbs. If you're going even longer, so if it's a really long, like 2-hour-long training run, maybe it's one of your 18 to 20 mile training runs ahead of a marathon, that's when you want to go all the way up to 4 grams of carbs. So 20 grams of protein and that 80 gram roughly mark of carbohydrates in that hour after. And that is not the meal you're gonna have. That is just like the recovery snack, right? And then within a couple hours after that, that's when you really want to get in a meal. And that's, I think, the hardest part for people to realize is like you really are eating all the time when you're training. No matter if you're training for a race or you're just doing it for fun, if you're an endurance athlete, if you're going for longer distances and whether you just enjoy it or you have performance goals, you need a lot of fuel. And people don't realize that. They're like, wait, I need more. Like, I need to have another, I'm always eating. Yes, you are. And if you don't feel like you're always eating, I encourage you to eat a little bit more. Because you really want to try your hardest to get in as much as you can throughout the day. I promise you, it'll help you to feel a lot better as you're training and racing. And so that hour after is also really important when it comes to recovery, when it comes to the fueling side of things. Does anybody have any questions on that part before we head over to hydration? And we can circle back if questions do come up. I just want to make sure we cover every part as much as possible. Okay, so when it comes to hydration, there's a lot of components to hydration, but I think especially when we go into the hotter months, our needs are obviously increased, right? When we think about hydration, everyone always knows water. Water is definitely needed, but not that they forget the electrolyte side of things, but it's always like, oh, I'm hydrated, I've got enough water throughout the day. But as endurance athletes, you're also sweating a lot. And in our sweat, we're losing electrolytes. The reason that sodium tends to come up more than any other electrolyte, like potassium, for example, is because your sweat is mainly composed, in terms of electrolytes, the highest percentage is sodium. So you're losing more sodium than any other electrolyte. Your body is really good at regulating. So you have a really good internal regulator of most of your electrolytes. But there is like a tipping point where it's like, I need a little more sodium, right? Like there's not much left. I can't regulate it as well as I want to, especially when it gets hot. But even if you're going for longer durations, that's another consideration. And so that's why sodium is always the thing that we talk about when we talk about hydration, in addition to water, because sodium is something you're losing a lot of when you sweat. Again, it's going to vary by person, and I know it's so frustrating to always hear, like, it's gonna vary by person, but it really does when it comes to nutrition. And so I really encourage you to play around with the amounts that you take in to see how you feel. Some people are saltier sweaters, so if you finish a workout, if you finish a workout, it's me also. You finish a workout and like you look and you have like these like little white streaks. Yeah, you have the white streaks whether it's on you or it's on your clothes. You're a salty sweater, right? If you finish a workout and you're drenched, even if you don't see the white streaks, but if you know you get really, really sweaty when you're exercising, you need more sodium. So I always give a range, and this range is mainly where I start athletes, but it's gonna vary by person. So I typically recommend starting between 300 and 600 milligrams of sodium every hour for exercise over roughly 60 to 75 minutes. So if you're going out there, you know you're not a salty sweater, and you know it's really hot out, let's start you at 300 milligrams an hour, right? You can probably get that from some gels, just one gel even will give you 300 milligrams, or just a serving of most traditional like lower to medium intensity electrolyte mixes will give you that amount. I think there's this kind of like false sense that we need so much sodium. When you look at some brands that have like thousands of milligrams of sodium, some people might, right, every hour, but if you're going for, say, something like LMNT, which has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, Element is great, but most people don't need 1,000 milligrams every hour that you're training. So just cut it in half. Have half the first hour, half the second hour, and see how that feels. You don't have to eliminate it. You can still use your favorite if it's your favorite flavors, if you tolerate it well. But I just wouldn't recommend that much every hour. The reason being that what can happen is with sodium, if you're taking in too much, you can start to feel bloated or you can be retaining water. And that doesn't feel too good for some people, right? Some people are okay handling the higher load of sodium, but other people aren't as good at flushing it out of their system, and you might feel a little bit more bloated. And so I always get questions of like, how do I know if I'm taking too much? And it's like, if you're running and you're not really feeling too great, you're feeling like at the end, your feet are a little swollen, and it's not because you just ran for 3 or 4 hours, but like you're just feeling a little more bloated, a little more swollen more generally, it could be an indication that you might be taking a little too much sodium every single hour that you're out there. On the other hand, when it comes to too little sodium, you could feel really fuzzy, right? When you finish, you could feel fatigued, extra fatigued for the rest of the day. You could be feeling, a little nauseous. Those are all likely indications. If you finish and you're like seeing stars a little bit, right? You're like a little woozy. That's likely an indication that we need to tinker with your hydration a little bit and up the amount of electrolytes and fluids that you're taking in. So I typically start athletes around 300 to 600 milligrams of sodium every hour that you're out there. If you're going for 45 minutes, you don't need to take any sodium with you. Your body has enough to get you through that, even if it's a higher intensity kind of situation. But if you're starting to go into the hour and a half mark, that's where I really want you to make sure you have sodium with you. Whether it's in those salt stick chews, you can do capsules. So some people like the pills that you swallow. I would just caution you that if you are gonna take those, make sure that you're kind of taking them ahead of time because you need to digest those, right? So it's not like the salt stick chews where you're really just letting them kind of like disintegrate in your mouth and that goes right into your system. With the capsules, you have to actually digest that capsule in order to allow your body to really utilize that sodium. So just keep that in mind. When you're working at a high intensity, you will digest that a bit faster, but it might take you, 30 to 45 minutes to really feel that effect. So you just want to make sure if you are someone who's using the pills, just make sure that you're taking them a little bit preemptively to help mitigate any sort of digestion kind of delay that you might see. But you can use those, you can use the pills, the chews, like I said, gels. You can bring a bottle like I did when I was racing. That's totally fine. If you are lucky enough to have people on course for you, you can just have them hand you the bottle, right? With some more in there. I would just recommend giving them the bottle already mixed with everything that you need, just so you know it's exactly what you're looking for, because you just never know. I know if I gave it to my dad, I'd be like, she needs a little extra, and I'm like, Dad, I need you to just give me exactly what is in here, because if there's too much, it's not gonna sit right.
What if someone takes Element every day as like their daily, they put one in their water or a noon tablet? I think that's, most of our runners are taking some sort of electrolyte on a daily basis. How do you know then how much more you need for every run?
So it's similar to carbohydrates where at a baseline, athletes need more sodium than the average individual. So you want to make sure you're hydrating throughout the day, whether you're having something like Element T or Noon. I wouldn't recommend a full serving of Element T kind of just on the day-to-day. I know people love it, and if your blood pressure is okay, then you should be fine. Like I said, your body is a fantastic regulator, but most people don't need that much unless you're training at really, really high intensities or in the summer. That's the one kind of time where it might be okay for you to have an Element T every single day, just as like a daily rehydration. But I would recommend more in the range of like a Noon tablet, where it's closer to, or even Scratch, which is fantastic, 200 to 400 milligrams, just as like your daily rehydration. That's totally fine. Because when you think about what you're eating, right, throughout the day, you're going to be getting enough sodium. At a baseline, most people get more sodium than they need. So I'm not too worried that we're not kind of getting enough of the electrolytes on the day-to-day. It's more when you're actually training that you need to make sure you're getting enough. And then the other component is the water side of the hydration. So when it comes to water, every hour, I know it sounds like a lot, and I don't want you going there right away. But when it comes to water, you want to try to aim for at least like 14 to 16 ounces of water every hour that you're out there. Now, in a race, impossible. Absolutely impossible. Unless maybe you're a professional and have bottles every, few miles. But it's pretty impossible to get that much. I tend to kind of skew down towards like 10 to 12. If you can get into 10 to 12 ounces every hour of your race, fantastic. But in training, you really want to try to get your body closer to the 14 to 16 ounces every hour. You have the ability, hopefully in New York, to whether it's stop and get a bottle of water or stop at any sort of water fountain, to give yourself what it needs so that you can recover in training, right? Because while you're training, you want to make sure that you're staying as healthy as possible, you're staying as hydrated as possible, and you do have more of an opportunity to get the hydration you need on the day-to-day, especially when it's hot out. In New York, in the summer, when I see people in Central Park, I'm like, do you have a bottle? Where's your bottle? Like, I'm going around like, who doesn't have a bottle here? Like, and you see everyone stopping at the hydration station, like the water stations, which is fantastic. But you really want to make sure, especially in the summer, that you're getting in enough fluids because you're going to be sweating a lot more. What's interesting though is that in the winter, I feel like a lot of people don't hydrate because they're like, oh, I'm not really sweating as much. No, you are. You just don't see it in the same way, right? So you still need to make sure you're hydrating even in the winter, aiming for that 14 to 16 ounces. I know this sounds crazy, but in the summer, so like I mentioned, I'm a heavy sweater and a salty sweater. In the summer, when I run on the boardwalk in Rockaway, so I'm from there, my parents live there, and it's my favorite place to run. There's tons of like stands that you can get water, watermelon juice also, fantastic. But I actually was taking in closer to 32 ounces of water every hour when I was running because I was sweating so much. It was like 80 degrees, and it's hot. And even if you go earlier, I knew that I needed more and I just couldn't really keep up with how much I was sweating. And so it really is going to vary by person, but I don't want you going towards even 16 ounces right away, because that's gonna feel really uncomfortable. You wanna sip over the hour if you can. And so a lot of people, what tends to happen is they either gulp down a lot all at once. So it's like towards the end of the hour and they have their bottle like, uh-oh, I'm really thirsty. And then they gulp it down. But that's a lot for your stomach to handle at once. So similar to what you were saying, Sam, with how you fuel, where you take little sips every once in a while, you want to try, whether it's a handheld or if you have a bottle or a belt that has a bottle in it, just try to take sips every 10 or so minutes to really get yourself used to, okay, taking in a little bit more and a little bit more. I don't want you to go crazy thinking like, okay, did I get my 16 ounces? Just try your best, see what feels good for you, right? Because everyone's gonna be different. And then after you're done, once you finished your workout, then you can kind of try to see, okay, do I feel like I needed a little more? Do I feel a little fuzzy? Was I getting any cramping? Did I feel fatigued for the rest of the day? Those are ways and indications to us that we may not have hydrated well enough. The other indication is your urine. However, a lot of people take supplements. So if you're taking any supplements like a multivitamin that has any sort of B vitamins in there, that's gonna automatically turn your urine yellow. So do not use your urine as an indication of hydration, because it's not going to tell you very much. But if you're not taking supplements, you don't use like any sort of multivitamin, or you don't use nutritional yeast, which also tends to be fortified with a lot of B vitamins, then you can use your urine as like a general indication of, okay, is it really yellow? I need more water, right? If it's too clear, so I think what people don't realize is if it's too clear, you don't want that either. That means that you're not getting enough electrolytes. Too much water, not enough electrolytes. So that's another thing to kind of look at and to use as a measure of, okay, how hydrated am I? Do I have too much water, not enough electrolytes? Not enough electrolytes, too much water, whatever it might be. You want like kind of like a lemonade color if you're not taking any sort of supplements with you.
And also the frequency.
Yes.
Like if you get home from a 2-hour run and you don't pee for 2 hours, you are so dehydrated.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so sincere. Like,
yeah,
it's happened to me in the summer specifically, where you are carrying water with you. You're doing all the right things, and then you get to brunch and you're like, I have not peed all day.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
I don't want you to have to like stop and pee while you're running, but if you're not peeing regularly, there's something off, whether it's how much water you're taking in, how many electrolytes you're taking in, how much you're sweating. So even just learning that about yourself, especially as it starts getting warmer, is going to be pretty important.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good point. And I don't want you either at the end of a session or a race to gulp down a ton of water, because that one is not safe. Especially if you're super dehydrated, it can actually be really dangerous to just gulp down, say, 16 to 20 ounces of water all at once, which, sometimes we really want to because of how dehydrated we are, but don't do it. Just try to sip over that hour and get in your fluids, and then continue to have some sort of water with you. That's where I recommend having some sort of a rehydration, is following your run. In the morning, it's also great, say, ahead of a big race, but it's typically afterwards that you're gonna wanna continue that replenishment process, and that's when you can have your daily rehydration to make sure you're getting in enough electrolytes and enough fluids throughout the day. As a general rule of thumb, and this is not even specific to athletes, but for just the everyday person, you might have heard like the 8 ounces, 8 glasses of 8 ounces of water a day, right? Where that comes from is the general kind of it's based on the general 2,000 calorie per day diet. So clinically, the way we dose your fluid needs for an entire day is every calorie gets 1 milliliter of fluid. Because when you think about how much your body needs to digest what you're taking in, you need at least a 1-to-1. So if you take in 2,000 calories, 2,000 milliliters of fluid, which is also 64 ounces or 8 ounce glasses of water. So that's where that kind of general rule of thumb comes from. But athletes need way more than that. Not only because you're sweating a lot more, but also because carbohydrates need more water to be digested, right? Every gram of carbohydrate that you take in, when it's stored in your body as glycogen, it's stored with 3 to 4 grams of water. So water is a huge component of carbohydrate digestion, absorption, and storage. And so athletes just need more hydration on the day-to-day from both a sweat and a digestion standpoint. And so just try your best to keep with you at all times some sort of fluid. Whether you have a glass of water next to you, you have a glass of water and something that has flavor in it next to you, so you have a few different options, and a coffee, whatever you need to do, just have them near you so you just remember to take in something throughout every single hour, because you don't want to be playing catch up. You don't want to be having kind of hours go by without going to the bathroom, because that's not a good sign, right? You want to make sure you're urinating regularly, especially as an athlete. So it's just something to consider, and remember as you're going through training, whether you're training for a race or you're just enjoying it as an endurance athlete, just day-to-day training and having a good time, you still need that hydration. And then in New York, when it gets into the 80s and it feels like it's 200 degrees, that's when you really want to make sure you're getting in enough. And it's hard, right? There's no way you're going to be able to replenish everything. And so every hour, just try to keep sipping. That's when an LMNT might be helpful, is in those really hot summer months if you are going out for a run. And I would always encourage trying to get out earlier if you can. Just because one, races tend to be earlier in the morning or sometimes really late at night, but they're not typically in the middle of the day. So just try your best to get out as early as you can so you're not going out in the heat of the day, because it can be dangerous even if you are getting in enough. And also have ice in there. So if you can have ice in your bottle, it actually is really helpful, because from a heat standpoint, your body is going to be getting really, really hot. And so the fluids, if they do have some ice in there, it'll help to cool you down a little bit internally and keep you from overheating at least slightly more than if you kind of just took lukewarm water or lukewarm hydration with you. Does anybody have any questions kind of on any of that at a baseline?
I have two.
Sure.
One, do you have any recommendation on, like, I've heard, like, oh, if you take water with your gel, it might, like, help that process better. But I guess, like, while you're, like, kind of, if you have a strategy, like, dealing with this while doing this and it's
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Yeah. So to your first question, some gels are actually formulated in a way that they don't need additional water with them. They're called isotonic. And so with those gels, you don't actually need any additional water to digest the gel itself. That does not mean you don't need additional water though. You still need to keep hydrating. It's just that the gel doesn't need anything additional to digest those carbohydrates. There are some gels that are not isotonic, and those are typically like the thicker, kind of more like honey stinger, for example, where it's like a really thick, like sugary sweet consistency. Those need a little bit more water. There's no like, you need, 8 ounces to digest this. Just try to get in a few sips. Just if you can get in a few sips, time it. I tend to have athletes actually time as best as we can, depending on the race, if you are racing. Time it towards your station. So if there's a water station nearby, have your gel, take a little sip of water, keep going. And that can be one way to make sure that you're getting enough, or just take a bottle with you if you can, or a little soft flask. One has your fuel, one has your hydrate, like even just water. One has a little bit of water, so you can just take a few little sips just to wash it down and make sure that you're getting in a little something. You also see that the ones that are not isotonic, they have directions on them. So it literally says like, take with some water. That's the directions. But if you ever have any concerns or questions like, is this isotonic? Do I need water with this? You can just drop me an email and I can help you navigate that. But typically they will say on there whether or not they're isotonic, and then it's typically the kind of more like honey consistency gels that need a little extra water with it.
And my second question is just in terms of like cramping. If there's like if you are cramped during a run and you're like, I need to drink water but I don't feel great, like is there any sort of like tactic, I guess?
Yeah, great question. So when it comes to cramping, there's a whole host of reasons why someone might be cramping, right? So hydration is always my first point of call, whether it's from a water standpoint or an electrolyte standpoint. So it could be that you're not getting enough water. It could be that you're getting in too much water, not enough electrolytes, or too little of both, right? And so what I would recommend in those moments is having something, whether it's salt stick chews or even like a capsule, like a pill. Those are really helpful moments where you do not want to take down very much, because you can get the capsule down, you'll tolerate that okay, because you're not having to taste anything necessarily. And then just try to make sure that you're getting in little sips where you can. So don't gulp down fluids, because especially if you're not feeling good, it's not gonna, I know it might be like, okay, if I just get it down, like if I take down a big sip, I'm just gonna try to keep it down. I would just recommend small sips more frequently, and then having something with a little flavor can be really helpful. But you don't want it to be too sweet. So like you can even have like a non-sugary kind of beverage or a watered down version of an electrolyte mix, and that tends to be really helpful for a lot of athletes, in addition to the capsules, which tend to be pretty helpful for some people. And then the other part of your question, the first question is like, how do you kind of manage it all?
Yeah.
So the one point that I will make is first and foremost, if you time for a race, if you can time it to the water stations or the hydration stations, it makes it a little bit easier for you to not think like, okay, you see a hydration station coming up, take your gel, keep going. If you don't want to kind of have to think too much about the time, that's one way that we can work together to really make sure that you're fueling enough. However, that can be tricky sometimes because most of us, myself, like I am not very good at, pacing myself throughout the entire race. And some miles are faster, some are slower, happens the best of us, and want to be consistent from a timing side of things. So I always have athletes go by time, not miles, because from the beginning to the end of your race, you might be negative splitting the second half of your race, right? You might be going faster in the second half of your race, but you still need to fuel just as consistently, right? If you fuel every 4 miles, it's going to differ from the beginning of the race to the end of the race. So just try to use time as a general guide, but if you are struggling to kind of figure out how to manage it all, having like a hydration station as a guide can be helpful as a first point of call. The other is one soft flask with your fuel, one with a little bit of water, so that at the very minimum okay, every time I take this, I have to take a little bit of this one. There's no kind of like specific amount, just try to take a little sip just to kind of wash it down, and you should be good to go, and then just focus on the hydration stations on course. The other point is in training. So training is the real kind of like gold for figuring out how to manage it all and starting slow. So if you've never fueled and hydrated during any sort of training session or race, I would recommend start with one. I always start athletes actually with hydration because if you're not hydrated, there's a whole host of things that can go wrong. You can kind of get away with like 60 minutes. You're not gonna feel great, but you can get away at 60 minutes, 75 minutes with not much fuel. But if you're not hydrated and it's hot out, you will not feel good. So I always start athletes with actually hydration, making sure you're getting enough water, making sure you're getting enough electrolytes. And then once we've kind of figured that out, you feel comfortable, your stomach can handle that, maybe we try an electrolyte mix as a way to kind of get you started on the carbohydrate side of things. We can start with an electrolyte mix like Scratch, which has about 20 grams, 25 grams of carbs a serving. So you still get a little bit, but not a ton. And then we can add in the gels and the chews and the solids depending on what you want to use. But hydration always comes first just because that's sort of the main limiting factor, and then fueling is also a limiting factor, but it's kind of like the secondary point. So I would say just start slow, take it one step at a time. It can be really overwhelming with all the different kind of components of nutrition. And so when I work with athletes, I always have it, you start, like don't think about anything else. Hydration is the only thing I want you to think about this week, and that's all I want you to focus on. And then once we can kind of get that in place, then we move over to fueling. And then once you have that in place, then you can think about supplements. But it can be really hard to kind of manage all the different pieces all at once. And so start slow and be easy on yourself. I think, like I said, a lot of times, especially runners and endurance athletes, we can always be like, I need to do everything all at once. Like, I heard this person doing that, and I see this person on social media doing X, Y, Z. Just try to start slow, really try to tune out that noise because it can be really overwhelming, and everyone's needs are gonna differ, and it ultimately matters what works for you, and it's gonna differ to the person on social media telling you X, Y, Z thing that they're doing that might work for them. And so just be easy with yourself as you go through the process, and start early.
And know that some of them are going to be terrible disasters.
Yes.
And it's
But
not,
remember, it's not you, and it's still a win. Knowing, even if something's a terrible disaster, you will laugh about it afterwards too. In the moment, it might not feel great, but it's ultimately a win because now we know, okay, whether it's something that you don't tolerate or it's something you don't like the taste of, we didn't know that before. And so, God forbid, there was a race you're doing that had that gel on course and you went to try it, that would have been even worse, right? And so these are all kind of little victories for us. They're data points that we're gathering along your training session, whether they work for you, whether they don't. It's all a victory in terms of like us understanding what works the best for you, even if it's something that's a total disaster. Like I've had gels that I've tried in the middle of a long run, I'm like, I think I'm gonna throw up. Like I think I had to stop my run, the workout was over, like just awful. But it was still a win because I'm like, okay, now I know I don't tolerate this, but it doesn't mean that you won't tolerate it, right? It might work for you. And so it's just a matter of figuring that out. I know, like in New York, for example, like I love SIS beta fuels, but SIS's regular gel was what's on course. Do not tolerate that at all. Does not go down, can't handle it. So I knew for me, I needed to take my own gels, and I needed to make sure that I had that for myself. The other thing is, I think a lot of people, they tend to rely on the on-course fueling, but it might not always be frequent. Like for example, in New York, I think it was once or twice that you could get fuel in a 26-mile race, right? 26.2 miles with 2 kind of areas where you can maybe get a gel or 2, is not what you want. So I always say that those are like the other emergency button. Like that is like your, okay, did I lose a gel? Like, do I know I tolerate it? Like, those are the moments where you want to go and grab those, but you don't want to rely on those as your main point of fuel. You always want to take your own fuel with you and know kind of roughly how often you want to be having it, whether it's every 15 minutes, whether, like Sam said, she just takes a little bit every once in a while and knows, you know, at the hour mark, I need to be, you know, halfway through this, or I need to be a quarter of the way through this soft flask, and just eyeball it. It's not, you know, something that you have to be, you know, overly concerned about, but just try your best to hit those markers and see how you feel during the race, but also knowing that and feeling confident that you tried it in training and you know, okay, this worked for me in training, let's hope it works today. But even if something works for you in training, even if, you know, you've tried it in different conditions, different intensities, something might happen during the race that, you know, whether it's you ate something the day before, you ate something, you know, a couple of days before, or, you know, maybe you were not hydrated adequately or whatever it might be, something might not work right. But again, we all have races that maybe aren't our best, but we learn a lot from those, and I think those are like the best, honestly, experiences in my opinion. Every race that I had that hasn't quite worked as well as I thought, I learned so much and I became a better runner from those moments, and they're learning experiences for us. So while it can be hard in the moment to be like, oh, like that didn't really go as I planned it to, there's a lot to take away from it still, and it's not a failure. And so just remember that too. No matter what, like we all have ups and downs, we have good days and bad days for whatever reason, nutrition related or not. And some things are out of our control in that regard, but we can just try our best to get to the start line feeling prepared. And I think that is kind of like the main takeaway, is just try your best to be prepared from every angle, from a training, recovery, and nutrition standpoint, and kind of a holistic mind-body standpoint. And you should be okay. But sometimes things just happen, and we can't control for those. So just
and one thing on that is check the expiration dates of your gels.
Yes.
Don't stop. Like it's always, I'm like buying my stuff on the feed, like, oh, I'll get 4 boxes of this, that should last me X days. And then they expire 6 months later, and you reach for one, you take it, and it tastes totally normal, everything's the same, and then your stomach hates you. So they do expire. There's one that you introduced me to last year that you freeze.
Yes, the never second one.
Yeah, and I don't know the flavor of it, but it's in the freezer and it doesn't expire that way. So I'm like, that's my backup plan for when it's really hot in the summer to have something to cool me off and also have fuel. So use the like gift cards from the feed to kind of buy a bunch of different things that you're going to use over the next couple of days, or rather the next couple of weeks, and like try one brand on one run, then try a different brand, and then if you want to mix and match those brands, do that. But you have an opportunity to really see like what feels really good. Like I know that Martin works for me. It works for a lot of people without stomach upset, but after a while, I don't really love the texture of it. So, and I think most people don't like the texture of a gel, I would say, after mile 20.
Yeah.
And that's where you need to have a backup plan of something to take.
Exactly.
And even if it's like something simple like gummy bears, where you have to switch to something that you know you tolerate and you know you enjoy, but just kind of start thinking like way ahead of whether it's a half marathon, a full, or you want to run longer. Start exploring like what feels really good for you, what doesn't feel really good for you, and then you don't have to change your plan. Like that's something it's so easy to see this new shiny object and like, oh, I gotta try this.
Yeah.
Well, if you know what works for you and it still exists, stick with that. Like find what works, and then you can play and experiment. But like, if you know something works for you and you've had success on it, your stomach handles it, it tastes good, whatever, then do that. Don't feel like, oh, well, this person said that they did this and they cut off 15 minutes from their time. No, they didn't. Not because of the gel that they changed to. I promise you it has nothing to do with the gel that they took. Maybe they're
just maybe they tolerated that gel better and now they're fueling and they're hitting their targets. But if you're hitting their targets, you're feeling good, there's no reason to change. And I think it's a really good point, because I think a lot of times, especially on social media, people are like, this worked for me, or like brands are always talk about professional athletes who are using certain things, and it's wonderful that it works for them, but you don't have to use it if you already have something that you know really works. And you don't have to use the shiny object in terms of sports nutrition, right? You can use something that maybe nobody knows about. Like except it's a very small, like not so well-known brand. On the feed, it's wonderful because they do have a lot of brands that aren't kind of the most well-known, like 60, for example. I think it's a brand from the EU or maybe the UK, but fantastic. I love it. Do I know a lot of runners that use it? No, but I love it. It works for me. They have a few different kind of options for gels. So they have one that's 20 grams, they have one that's 30, and then they have one that's 45, which is like their ultra gel. And some of them are isotonic, some of them aren't, to your point. So there's the one that I use, the mango one, is 30 grams. That has 200 milligrams of sodium. It's not isotonic. I mix it with some Morton, and I do have my hydration, so I take a little bit. Again, brands probably wouldn't like that mixing things, but I like my own little concoctions, and it works for me, right? But their 20 gram gel is a little bit more watery. So if you are someone who towards the end of the race you're like, I can't look at another gel that's like really thick, whether it's Morton, whether it's something like Honey Stinger, Huma, which is another one that I love, but towards the end of a race, I really can't handle it either. I'm like, this is too much. Use a more watered down gel, so a gel like that's more isotonic, because it can be a little bit more helpful in terms of just getting it down. It's not as cloyingly sweet, and it tends to work well for a lot of athletes, especially towards the end of a race. So that could be like your emergency button if nothing else is working. Like, okay, here's my more watery gel, but it still has 20, 25 grams of carbs, which is perfect. But you can kind of play around with the different gels, and some of them are bigger than others too, right? Like the Never Second Frozen one is huge. It's literally like it is like one of those like
it's a popsicle.
Yeah, it's a popsicle basically. And you can freeze it and then take it with you, or you can kind of stop halfway through your run if you can, stop close to home, get it. And the idea is that it will help to cool down your internal body temperature because it's icy, right?
Mine usually melts. I keep it in my sports bra and I'm like, oh my god, it's warm now.
Yeah.
But it does keep you cool temperature-wise, at least like when it's really hot.
Exactly. And there are some other gels. The feed actually did a post on this. We did this when I was still there. It was probably like 6 or so months ago. Some that freeze really well, some that don't freeze so well, like even not the Never Second Ice one. And some of them are really, really good frozen. So I would just recommend playing around with it if it is something, especially in the summer. I really like even their regular Never Second gel. It freezes really well, and then it kind of like slowly thaws at the 30-minute marks. And, oh yes, this is cold. But also you can just put ice in your bottle and just have that as like.
And scratch popsicles are the best.
Yes.
I live for
Yeah.
those.
Also, I've been on like a Pedialyte popsicle kick. I know people.
Right.
It works for you, and you can find them doing Read. And I was like, oh my god, these are amazing. They've got like 125 milligrams of sodium. So at the end of the day, like if you're really struggling to still get in a lot of more electrolytes, if you don't want to have a Never Second gel and you just want more electrolytes, you can either make like your own popsicles with some sort of electrolyte mix, or you can just run to the supermarket and get some Pedialyte pops and just have a couple of those to finish off your day. They'll also change the textures, give you something that's a bit cooler, because you're still going to be feeling the effects. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever felt this, kind of, especially in summer, like your body just feels hotter after you're racing and after you're training, especially in the heat. So it helps to really cool you down, whether you take them with you or you have it afterwards. If you can have some things that are colder, it is really beneficial to keep your body temperature cooler. And you might even have seen this in a lot of the warmer, like long distance races. If you watch them on television or you look at any of the recaps, they've got like sponges, they've like all the
bags of ice.
Bags of ice. Like they're really trying to keep their body temperature cooler. And so whatever you can do in that regard, but just play around with it in training. Some gels, like I said, freeze better than others. Some don't freeze at all. Like Morton doesn't freeze, which I actually kind of liked it. It was just like cold. But then one of my good friends was like, it kind of tastes like a jellyfish, sort of like a cold jellyfish. I was like, you just ruined it for me because I really enjoyed it until you said that. But I still love it. Like, it's not frozen, but it's just cold. And it stays that way for a little bit. So if you are a fan of Morton, I love Morton's gels, like similar to you. I use them a lot. If you are a fan, they don't freeze. So just know that off the bat. There are a few others that don't freeze. So if you are like, why is this not? Don't be alarmed if they don't, because it's normal for some of them.
And one last thing that I'm going to touch on is she said about using gels to practice in a quality session of sorts. Threshold workouts are really good because that tends to be around your 10K or half marathon pace. So it's a pace that you need to learn how to digest at. Marathon workouts, aerobic strength, any of your long runs on the weekends, obviously. But during the week, I wouldn't do it. If you're doing hills or you're doing anything that's interval repetition, even critical velocity pace, like when they're faster and your heart rate is up a lot higher, I would do it after your warm up. Like pause your watch, take it, then do all of your reps. And then if you need to take a second one, if you're out there for 90 minutes or so, take a second one. But start to understand how your body feels when you're digesting it on the go. It's the same thing as if your body temperature rises, you can't perform at this. Your body's trying to cool you down. So it's not worried about digestion. So those are instances where you do throw up or you can't take it down.
You feel like your muscles are seizing a little bit. Like
Yeah.
It really starts to shut down.
So I do think that that's just something to start thinking about now, since we've had this conversation. Now you're going to start exploring these type of things. Recognize that faster workouts are probably not going to be as easily digestible. So stop, pause after your warm up. I usually do it if I have more than 10 hill repeats. I'll take it before the first rep, and then I'll take something else before I head home on my cool down. Just because it is a lot of volume. It's a lot on your body, and for me to go empty and then come down here to work all day is just silly. So as much as it helps your performance, it also starts the process of recovery while you're in it. So now is like ideal time for everyone. If you haven't already, most of you that are training for races have been exploring this, but threshold workouts, especially like if you have a 20-minute threshold, that's like my favorite time to try a new gel, or do your 20-minute warm up, take the gel, do the 20-minute workout, go home, now you're at 40 minutes, and then eat your post-run snack. So there is an easy way. It doesn't have to be so complex, but once you know what works for you, then you just start implementing it and trying it out on your own.
Right, exactly. And I think too, like even in training, you don't always have to do the same thing that you will in racing. Like you want to be practicing your race strategy, to Sam's point, whether it's in the higher intensity or longer duration. But if you're someone who does not tolerate, say, bars or chews in your racing, in your race strategy, you can still try them out and have them during your day-to-day, like easier training. Just try to also practice your strategy every, once a week or so, just to make sure your body tolerates what you're actually going to be taking in on race day. But you don't always have to do the same thing. You can use Swedish fish. You can use, anything that works for you. I love like the Trader Joe's version of the Swedish fish. I use those all the time. Like it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. Just you want to give your body some sort of carbohydrates and water while you're training, because it does start that recovery process. And you will notice if you haven't been feeling kind of enough up until this point during your training, you will notice an improvement in your energy later on in the day, because you will feel more fatigued for the rest of the day because your body's trying to catch up if you're not fueling adequately while you're actually training, especially in like those really high intensity sessions. So just keep that in mind and really keep an eye out on how you're feeling, because I promise you're gonna have way more energy later on in the day once you start feeling like you're fueling adequately if you hadn't been up until this point. That was a really good point too. Any other questions on anything that we've talked about? I know it's a lot, and like I said, start with one area. Hydration is always my main point of call, and then kind of move from there. And if you ever feel overwhelmed or like you're not really sure where to begin, you can just drop me an email, and I'm happy to help out with any questions that you might have, or any gel options, because I've tried pretty much everything. And if you have any spoons, I did bring some gels if people want to try some things out.
By all means, if you are on the hunt now.
So if you want to try some new options, I did bring some gels just in case you are interested. Like Sam said, the feed is it's literally the only place I know of that allows you to buy single servings of things. So you can just buy single servings of any gel that you might be interested in trying. Like I said, they have a lot of European brands on there that aren't as well known in the US, which is also really nice, because some of their flavors I find, especially one of the food companies that I did work for was a UK based company. Their palate I know is less sweet, so anything that they made for the American palate had a slightly sweeter taste to it than the UK palate. And so just keep that in mind, like if you are someone who's like, all of this is too sweet, the UK and EU brands might actually be a good place for you to start, because they may be a little less sweet. Like I said, there's also a lot of more neutral and unflavored gels out on the market now that are just sort of like Morton in terms of the sweetness level, but they have different textures. So there's tons out there. If you are unsure where to begin, I can give you like a top 3 I would recommend, and then try to get your biggest bang for your buck with both carbs and electrolytes if you can, because that's another way. So you don't have to do as much thinking too with, okay, when do I need to take my sodium? When do I need to take my carbs? When do I need my water? Like it's a lot going on. So if you can get electrolytes and carbs in one, and every 20 to 30 minutes, if you get in, your set amount of gel, that you're going to get both, all you need to worry about is just getting enough water throughout the rest of it. So it makes it a little bit easier for you while you're also out there training and racing, because there's a lot going on the day-to-day. All you want to be having to do when you're on that start line is just run. Everything else you want to be muscle memory. So if you do have any questions or unsure where to begin, just drop me an email.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you.
That was awesome.